Hey folks, how you doing? It is 10 o'clock Central Standard Time, 11 o'clock Eastern Time. That would make it what? Roughly 8 o'clock Pacific Time. And Hawaii is a whole nother thing. And England, I think, is 5 or 6 hours ahead of us. So you can figure it out if you're coming from those places. Australia, I think you're 12 to 14 hours difference ahead of me. So I don't know what the hell time it is there. Probably roughly around noon on Saturday, I think. But anyway, good to have you all here. Rocky Stucci, good to see you in the room, brother. Michelle, nice to see you. Counting down the minutes, she said. And so good to have you. She Said It is here as well. Suze, good to see you. And so those of you who are here, and we're starting to build up and wait for those others to make it in, we'll cover just a little non-nothing at the beginning here, other than to say this is going to be chapter 9 tonight, which we're just about winding it up. This is not a long chapter, so depending on how we feel, it's only a few pages. But then we jump into another chapter that's about 15 to 17 pages. And that would be the final chapter for the book. And so before the conclusion, which is just a couple of pages. So let's see how we do tonight. And let's see what everybody feels like as we move along. Maybe a short show tonight is exactly what you're looking for. Or we could just make it go a long time and have some fun doing it. So where we've been so far, I think you're getting a pretty good picture of where my head was when I wrote this book. There are a few things, as you can see, and I've mentioned along the way, that are things that I'll be changing because my viewpoints have changed a little bit on them. And so this chapter is going to be interesting, this one and the following chapter, because it addresses that whole question that says the Nephilim, the purpose of the flood was to destroy the Nephilim and all of their offspring and to wipe them out. So God brought this great deluge on the planet to do this devastating thing to wipe this all out. And yet it was ineffective because it didn't take care of everything. And because it says that the Nephilim were here and then they were here also afterward, which is the title of this particular chapter. And Joe Lee, good to see you. Joyce, nice to see you as well. So here we go. I think we'll just kind of jump right into it now. I don't think I have any announcements, as they say, or anything pressing to talk about other than this. So let's move right into it. Unless any of you want to bring something up. So I don't see anything. So June, good to see you. And yep, story time. So let's roll into it. Short chapter, which we may just jump into the last chapter. So chapter 9, starting on page 207, and also Afterward. It was sometime during the mid-1990s, while deep in an engaging conversation with friends, that a little light bulb popped on over my head rather suddenly. We'd been talking about aliens, Dungeons and Dragons, Star Trek, and general metaphysical and ufological genre stuff. Enjoying the heady, mystical, metaphysical atmosphere we seemed to be conjuring up in front of the fireplace. Of course, the Guinness was flowing pretty freely, and we all had reached that higher plane of enlightenment. You know, the one where all your thoughts suddenly have no filters, and your words come out as if they'd been under restraint for all the days of your life prior to that moment. Well, this was one of those moments. I jumped to my feet, yelling several exclamatory expletives of joy upon realizing that I had just stumbled upon what was for me, a new discovery. At least for me. The information was nothing new, nor was it going to win me a Pulitzer or high praise around the world, but at that moment, it was completely new to me. UFOs and aliens are somehow inextricably linked to the flood of Noah and the wildly fantastic breed of hybrid Nephilim that appeared at the beginning of the biblical account. See, nothing new. But what occurred to me at the moment was a sudden understanding of the link between the events that took place thousands of years ago and what seemed like events that were taking place today. And this was the biblical passage that spawned the entire gadzooks scene in front of my friend's living room fireplace. Luke 17:26-27 says, "Just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. People were eating, drinking, marrying, and being given in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all." And cross-referenced this passage with Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 24:37-39, where he said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." Almost sounds like the same guy wrote both of those, doesn't it? These were the words of Jesus spoken to his disciples. There you go. So his disciples were recording his words in text form. In their context, they were speaking less about the conditions of the time of Noah than they were speaking to the suddenness of God's wrathful judgment, in that people were still marrying and partying all the way up until they heard the slamming door of the ark that Noah had been building for the last 120 years. Imagine that. That's 120 years. We, in our towns, we see new buildings going up or new construction, or we see a building with signs all over it, and we say, somebody bought that building. They're going to do something with it, but it's been sitting vacant for 7 years. And then all of a sudden there's a business, and you go, whoa, that happened overnight. When the first little droplets of rain started to pitter-patter off their foreheads, they suddenly realized that all Noah had been saying was coming to pass. It's not that they hadn't heard Noah's words of warning. It was that they didn't believe them. There was a deeper application of the passage than the simple suddenness of judgment. The idea that the things that were taking place all around us in current-day ufology and alien contact scenarios seemed to be exactly what was taking place when the Watchers interbred with human women and sired the Nephilim. We asked ourselves that night, is this a repeat of angelic or demonic beings attempting to infiltrate the human bloodline to stave off a second judgment? Was this the precursor to the fulfillment of all the eschatological prophecies and the path to Armageddon? Genesis 6:4 leaves us hanging on a haunting, almost chilling 3 words, and also afterward. We've already established that several passages in the books of Moses tell us that the Nephilim survived the flood, but this seems to stand in stark contradiction to the verse where in Genesis we're told, "And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, all swarming creatures that swam upon the earth, and every man, everything on the dry land, and those in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. He blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those that were with him in the ark." Genesis 7:21. Is this an oversight or a contradiction in the passage? Or was it an intentional ruse to throw us off the path of the Nephilim? It's clear that what Moses wrote was an account of the Hebrew version of the flood. But as we discovered earlier, the account of the Nephilim themselves, as recorded in the first few verses of Genesis chapter 6, have earmarks of having been edited or added completely at a later date. Was this the work of Joshua, Moses' successor? Or was it the addition of later scribes? Or does it simply mean the Nephilim were not considered as anything but the offspring of spirit beings, therefore not included in the list of things destroyed in Genesis 7:21? Then there's this question that is often in association with this entire topic. Could this hybrid race of Nephilim giants, produced from the union of the princes of heaven, the lesser gods of the divine council, and earthly women, still be roaming the earth today? Because according to Genesis 6:4, they survived the flood, regardless of who wrote the passage. If it's a detail that Moses did not write or was somehow unaware of, someone edited the text and added in the appropriate phrases, telling us that the Nephilim were still on the earth after the flood. That was supposed to have destroyed them. As discussed in chapter 8, the Old Testament mentions several occurrences of giants and Nephilim, appearing specifically the giant races of Canaan, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Horim, the Zamzumim, and the Anakim. Anakim, not Anakin Skywalker, which may be on everybody's mind if you saw the new trailer for the new Star Wars movie coming out in December today. Psyched! Deuteronomy 2:10-12 says, "The Emites used to live there, a people strong and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. Like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaites, but the Moabites called them Emites." I almost feel Adrian, what's his name, played by Robin Williams in Good Morning Vietnam coming on. You got the LC down in the NC, whatever that line was after the DNC, and so let me read that again just for emphasis. They were as tall as the Anakites, and like the Anakites, they too were considered Rephaites, but the Moabites called them Emites. Horites used to live in Seir, but the descendants of Esau drove them out. They destroyed the Horites from before them and settled in their place, just as Israel did in the land the Lord gave them as their possession. The kingdom of Og, the king of Bashan, was the land of the giants. That is the whole kingdom of Og in Bashan, who had reigned in Ashtaroth and Edrei, and had survived as one of the last of the Rephaites. Moses had defeated them and taken over their land. Joshua 13:12. Anak and his 7 sons of the Anakim were also giants, along with the famed Goliath and his 4 brothers. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore. Hold on, we got a little connection problem there. Not sure where it hit. Hopefully you can all still see me. The warning is gone. But I was just saying, his spear, Goliath's spear, was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. That's 1 Samuel 17:4-7. And then later in that same chapter, good, glad, Jolie, thank you. Once again, there was a battle between the Philistines of Israel. That's where the sentence ends. This is, by the way, one of my favorite scenes. I know a lot of people like the David and Goliath story because everybody knows it. It's like the Moses parting the Red Sea. It's like Noah loading the animals on the ark. It's like David and Goliath. All these stories were the familiar stories. Well, I did a lot of study, a character study on David a long time ago. And as I mentioned in some of these readings, read some good books about David, who existed. Don't think he didn't. Just because he appears in the Bible. I hate that argument, by the way. I'll have people go, "Oh, that's not true. It's just a book of faith." Well, that's not true. It's not just a book of faith. The Bible, like just about every other religious book or historical book from antiquity, was imbued with the spirituality or the religion of the people who wrote it. And while There are faith stories obviously wrapped around every historical story you can find. There was a time over 100 years ago where it was stated in biblical archaeology that over 1,500 things from the Old Testament were already verified as being truthful or factual by archaeologists. Now, what they're talking about is the history, not the faith. The faith part is something you can accept or reject. Faith, it's in the eye of the beholder. But the historical facts have borne out. And it makes the Old Testament especially is full of efficacious history. So the kind of history I'm talking about is not, and the people turn their hearts to God. You can have an account like that, or you can have an account that says something about God befriended Moses as a man talks to his friend. Those are faith stories. You can't prove those. But to say the Philistine army was camped on the hills above the valley of Jezreel, those are things that are historical fact. And they found the encampment of the Philistines. That was there. They were there for a long time. And there's remnants of the encampment left over from this battle where David fought their champion. Now, you can't prove that Goliath existed. What you can prove is that the Philistines fought the Israelites on that site. How many years ago is that? That's almost 3,000 years ago. So anyway, let me move on here. This is the passage out of the Bible. It says this: once again, there was a battle between the Philistines and Israel. David went down with his men to fight against the Philistines, and he became exhausted. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels, and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. But the Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to, sometimes those consonants all running together, just a Zeruiah. Maybe it's like, in the Hebrew, like Zeruiah, came to David's rescue. He struck the Philistine. Now listen to this. This is interesting because this is something I read in Joel Baden's book about David. He said there's actually another passage in the Old Testament that says David didn't slay Goliath. It says this: and Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the Rapha, whose bronze spearhead weighed 300 shekels, and who was armed with a new sword, said he would kill David. Now, perhaps this is a later battle, but listen to this. But Abishai, son of Zeruiah, came to David's rescue. He struck the Philistine down and killed him. Then David's men swore to him, saying, "Never again will you go out with us to battle, so that the lamp of Israel will not be extinguished." Okay, I can see here. Now, I've heard some things where it said David may have not been the man who slew Goliath, but this particular thing, if David is there, he's fighting, he's got men. This is a slightly different story than the first story of David and Goliath. And of course, we don't see those names here. He may have already been captain of the king's bodyguard. He may have been fighting with the army. It said he has men. When he met with Goliath, he was a shepherd boy for his father. And he was bringing sandwiches to his brothers who were at the battlefront. So, never again will you go out to battle, he tells them. And in the course of time, there was another battle with the Philistines. Yep, at Gob. At that time, Sibbecai, the Hushathite, killed Saph, one of the descendants of Rapha. And another battle with the Philistines of Gob, Elhanan, son of Joreh-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath, the Gittite, meaning from Gath, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. Did you get that? David slew Goliath, but it says here, this is what I was referring to. Elhanan, the son of Jare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, being from Gath, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod. There was a huge man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all. He also was descended from the Rapha when he taunted Israel. Jonathan, the son of Shimea, David's brother, killed him. These 4 were descendants of Rapha in Gath, and they fell at the hands of David and his men. 2 Samuel 17:16 through 22. Now, I'm not prepped to talk about this so much as what I remember reading and things I pondered. Remember I told you about that book called King David, The Real History of an Invented Hero. And it was written by Joel Baden, Yale Old Testament history professor. And he talks about how David, being a real guy, was perhaps, and a lot of the stories written about him show earmarks of apologetics being applied. Deeds he did not do being ascribed to him. Things he did not say or nobody could have heard him say because they were private conversations, read as dialogue in a play or a movie or a book. They read as narrative. How would people know these things other than somebody entering them or writing them down later? They created apologetics about David. And now right here you see that these 4 guys from Gath, it'd be Goliath and his 3 brothers, were all, and this is something I missed when I wrote this text because I said Goliath and his 4 brothers because I was mentioning these 4. Well, Goliath is one of them, Goliath of Gath, Goliath the Gittite. And so, unless there's 2 big giants named Goliath that David killed, that would be awfully coincidental. But what Joel Baden was getting at was that some of these texts, they ascribed deeds to David to make David seem more powerful, more closer to God, more immaculate than he actually was. He was a tribal chieftain that unified the clans in the foothills of Judea and had a stronghold and became their king and had a hell of a time keeping them all wrapped up together. And so as they wrote his history, they wrote apologetics about him. This is going to make a good study, and I would like to write my own book on that someday. Let's see. She said, I just see it here. Barbara, how you doing, Barbara? Good to see you. Wave, wave, wave back. Let's see. Sue said the walls Jericho example could have been an ultrasound weapon that shattered the wall. Possibly. We don't know that. I do know that they've done excavation work on the walls of Jericho for almost 100 years. And it was, who was the famous archaeologist? Leakey? Was it Leakey? Perhaps. But they found that the walls had been destroyed. Some of them rebuilt later, but they found the walls tipped out from the city and crumbled down some of the hillsides. And so it's very interesting, you know, because it said that the walls fell outward from the city. Could have been an earthquake, could have been something else catastrophic, could have been the hand of God. We don't know for sure. So, but that's a different, this is why this passage is interesting in retrospect, because I didn't notice it at the time, or I glossed over at the time I wrote this. And that is that somebody else is listening. Elhanan, the son of Jare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, who had a spear with a shaft like a weaver's rod, which is what they said about Goliath back when we were describing him. The account of David and Goliath pits the youngest shepherd son of Jesse against the giant from Gath, who fought for the Philistines. Goliath came down from the ridge where the Philistines were encamped every day for 40 days. This dude was taunting the armies of Israel. The Philistines were all lined up on one ridge over there, and then there was the little valley in between, and then this ridge is where Israel's army was lined up. By the way, what's cool is you can go to this place today. it's still, that valley is almost unchanged. And there's also now, they found the encampments of the Philistines back in the hills on the one side of the slopes. And so they were there for quite a while. And for 40 days, these two armies glared at each other across the valley, and nobody did anything. But you had Goliath, if you remember the story. It said he came down from their side of the slopes, and he was yelling out to Israel and taunting them. And it's a small valley, by the way. You could say it's almost amphitheater-like. You could actually do that and be heard. So they were on the opposite ridge, and they were encamped there for 40 days, taunting the armies of Israel, calling them to single-hand combat, which is kind of what they did back in those days. King Saul, seeing this giant, had promised that whomever would defeat him in hand-to-hand single combat would, there were few things he offered. They would become Israel's champion. That man would also become the captain of the king's bodyguard. He'd get the king's daughter's hand in marriage, and his whole family would become tax-free in Israel all their days. Not a single soldier answered the call, but they remained encamped there, waiting for something to break. It says, now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle. I want you to listen to this. This is a great point that's to be made here. Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered together at Sochach, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Sochach and Azekah in Ephes Demim. I love these names, but I hate them. Now, this is, by the way, where they found the encampments in modern day versions of these names, of these name places around the valley there. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. That means, like, if you ever saw Braveheart, where they're taunting the English army and they're raising their kilts and banging on their shields. This is, they drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. Now, don't think Rocky Mountains. Just think these sloped hills of this hilliest region of Judea, and they were on one side of there was a ridge on one side that they could walk down into the valley, a ridge on the other side, on a mountain on the other side, and a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span, roughly 9'3". He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, and he had a bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, "Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we'll be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." Now, do you know how long this went on? It said it went on for 40 days. And there's an interesting point to be made here. You can still visit the valley of Elah today. I think I said Jezreel, Elah, where the flat, low valley is bordered on two sides by low ridges, and where the armies of Israel encamped on one side and the armies of the Philistines on the other. Saul was the logical choice to fight Goliath on 2 counts. He was the king. It's good to be king. And the Bible tells us that he stood head and shoulders over all the rest of the men of Israel. He was a tall dude. He was a big guy. He'd be like an NFL player amongst a bunch of, I don't know, bowlers. So Saul was a tall man, but nowhere near the height of the giant of Gath. When David came to the camp to deliver food to his brothers, who were soldiers in the Israelite army, he heard the tauntings of Goliath, who by that time had started ascending the Israelite side of the valley to shout out his challenge. That's the interesting point. I want you to hear it. It said they were doing this for 40 days, and Goliath would come down the slopes from the other side, and he'd taunt Israel. And by the time these 40 days had passed, and David shows up with lunch for his brothers, Goliath's coming up the Israelite side. He's coming right up to the lines. And he's probably up there taunting the shit out of them. And because nobody's coming out to fight him. And so it says, Goliath, who by that time had started ascending the Israelite side of the valley to shout out his challenge. David, as the story goes, answered the call. King Saul attempted to dress the shepherd boy in his own armor. Now, by boy in this story, David, by the biblical chronology of events that took place, probably in his late teens, 18, 19, maybe even 20 years old. He's just the youngest son of his father. So some commentators, King Saul attempted to dress the shepherd boy in his own armor. Some commentators think it was a ruse to let the rest of the army think it was Saul himself going into battle against the giant. But the armor was too big for David, and David went into the valley and faced off against Goliath, who mocked him in disdain. 2 Samuel 17, 41 through 44 says, So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked David over, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. So the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And he said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And of course, David replied, listen to this, this is apologetic at its best. You come to me with a sword and spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you've defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give your carcass to the camp. I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then everyone gathered here shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Now, does that sound like something a shepherd boy would say? Unless he was well studied at home. Maybe he was just an eloquent kid. But listen to that. Maybe he had no fear because he trusted in God. Maybe he had no fear because he knew of his skills with a sling. Earlier in the chapter, remember, he went to Saul and said, Who is this dog? I'll take him on. And Saul said, What do you know? And they all kind of laughed at him. His brothers laughed at him and tried to send him home. And he said, Look, I've killed lions with my sling. And he said, I can take this guy down. Now, was that maybe a little bravado? You know, think of a frat boy-aged kid, little bravado, and doesn't get out much and knows what he can do and thinks he can take the guy. Maybe he's the faithful, the true faithful. And so you listen to that eloquence coming from his mouth. And was he that kind of a guy? Was he just imbued with the power of the Spirit of God, and all these lovely things came out of his mouth? We don't know for sure. And the rest of the story we all know. David picked a smooth stone from the valley floor, while here's his Goliath is standing out there, saying, Come to me, boy, I'll give your bones to the fowls of the air. And what does David do? He stoops down, picks up a stone off the valley floor. Looks, this will do. And he put it in his sling and buried it into Goliath's forehead, killing him instantly. And before you go adhering to the theories that Goliath was just a man with giantism, therefore he had soft bones, keep in mind that he was called a man who had been a warrior from the days of his youth. 1 Samuel 17:33. When someone is inflicted with giantism, the older they get, the more brittle their bones become, and the more unstable their musculature and ability to function or even walk normally. Goliath was a warrior, but he was not a man inflicted with a physical ailment that gave him great size and debilitated him. Goliath was the offspring of the Nephilim remnant, and he had 4 other brothers. But what of the acts of the Watchers? Are they still happening today? Is mankind still being visited by the members of the Divine Council and those who left that domain thousands of years ago? And what of the Nephilim themselves? And you know what? That's the end of this little tiny chapter. If you'd like, by show of hands, we can slip into the next chapter. I'll tell you how long it'll be. That chapter was 8 pages, and the final chapter here, before we get to the conclusion, which is only a couple of pages, goes from 207 to 220, or 217 to 227. That's 10 more pages. So, hey, Jeannie, nice to see you. Yeah, Michelle, there was some great machismo going on there. PK Sakara, nice to see you. I think that's how you say your last name. And so let's slip into the next chapter. It's only a couple of pages longer than what I just read. So let's do it. All right, chapter 10. Where are they now? Is the title of the chapter. And by the way, it seemed that chapter ended rather abruptly. The story of David and Goliath was just something I slipped in there to show the remnant again that were there on the earth after they were supposed to have been defeated. They had all these descendants still coming. And I raised the question, is it possible that, like the verse says, that Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the time of the coming of the Son of Man, or the time of the era of the Son of Man, which is now. Anytime after Jesus is the idea. And so the end times even. And so I compared this at the time to the stories of alien abductions, the stories of women claiming that they had been impregnated by alien visitors. Sometimes not wacky people all the time. Sometimes they were very established people who came up with these stories. And so what if that's exactly what was happening in the days of Jared way back when the the Watchers descended to the slopes of Mount Hermon and went in unto human women. Remember Bill Burns' quote from the back of the book talking about UFOs. Remember him talking about the 33rd parallel, saying that Mount Hermon, as it where it sits today in the north of Israel, between Israel and Lebanon, that mountain sits on the 33rd parallel, and if you travel to the exact identical spot on the opposite side of the earth on the 33rd parallel, you get Roswell, New Mexico. Bill Burns said this is, and we talked about that way early in one of the early chapters. Bill Burns thinks these were these UFO highways. My good friend Anthony Sanchez wrote a book called UFO Highway, and talking about all these sorts of things. So there's why this starts to come together here. And I'm taking an exponential leap to say, what if that's what this is? All right. Let's see. Jeannie, I'll have to catch it on the rebound the last 30. Yep, you can do that. And because it'll be up as soon as we're done tonight. So let's start reading. We've only got 10 more pages of this chapter, to this chapter. Where are they now? Chapter 10. Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, says Hebrews 13:2 in the New Testament. For some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it. I was always fascinated by that passage in the book of Hebrews. In the New Testament, it said, show hospitality to strangers, because some have done that and entertained angels unawares. So there is a pervasive question regarding the Nephilim as to whether or not they are still among us today. The answer would simply be yes, but obviously not in the same form as they interacted with humanity thousands of years ago. And though there may be a bloodline remnant of the Nephilim evident throughout history, it would be a safe bet to say that it no longer has anything to do with the original Watchers. Their influence died thousands of years ago, unless there are more Watchers in the heavens who did not fall to the earth that day so long ago. There's little probability that their influence will ever be seen again. But the same cannot be said for their offspring. It is unknown whether the entire divine council of gods came to earth, touching down on the slopes of Mount Hermon, nor is there any way to calculate the number of beings who may have descended and intermingled with humanity over the millennia. See, that's the thing. We don't know if they've continued to come and go. But maybe this is the answer to the... and the Nephilim were on the earth in those days of the flood, and also afterward. It continued to happen. Let's see. What we know for certainty is that nearly every ancient culture experienced this brand of extraterrestrial, not of this earth, interruption on some level, bequeathing offspring that took the form of what we now deem as mythological or legendary beings, or better, the heroes of old and the men of renown. From the Tuatha De Danan's elven deities, the statuesque, bright, shining giants of the Celtic peoples. Remember, they were the Tuatha were known as the shining kings from heaven. How about that? In the Irish mythology. To the Sasquatch of the Native Americans, there have been genetic footprints left in nearly every ancient culture throughout all of recorded history. Michelle says, the more you learn, the less you know. Sue said she doesn't know about that. She's entertained a few demons. And I will tell you this. I have an old saying, and I probably said it here, even during these readings. I always used to say, I found that the more shit I know, the more I know I don't know shit. So let's apply that as we keep reading. As we've already seen, there were Abraham. The Nephilim are mentioned as having dwelled in the region around the Dead Sea, scattered amongst several tribes. The footnotes of the Jerusalem Bible suggest that Moses, in the Genesis 6 passage, intended his words on the Nephilim to be an anecdote of this superhuman race. According to the Jerusalem Bible's commentary, Moses does not go into great detail, nor does he make any bones about representing the Nephilim as the offspring of superhuman beings, as it was already a known entity in his day. He merely referenced them in order to establish in his account of Noah's flood the severity of the wickedness that was present on the earth prior to the meting out of God's judgment by flood. In Christian evangelical circles, there are those who believe that these watchers came down to pollute the messianic bloodline of Jesus Christ by interfering with human DNA. The pure, necessary humanity of the Messiah would thus be thwarted before it ever came to be. Along with ancient alienist Chuck Missler, an evangelical Christian, also believes that the Watchers were extraterrestrials or gray aliens, who were, in actuality, fallen angels or demonic beings setting out to muddy the messianic waters. The history of the human race is synonymous with the history of great spiritual conflict. When we view world politics today, many of us wonder why we can't just all come to the table and settle disputes in a peaceful fashion. To some extent, it seems to me that the gods and every caste of spiritual being beneath them seem intent on not being able to do what seems so common sense to humans. Okay, you ever wondered about that? Why do demons want to wreak havoc? Is it because they're just stupid? They're just stupid demon. Hashtag shut up, as Rocky would say. Because humans kind of want to find a way to get along. I know I was talking to some that's a bad way to say it. I was going to say high-ranking. I was talking to some demonologists, some people who have done very intrinsic study on this stuff. One of them was John Zaffis years ago. There was Adam Bly. And they insisted that the demonic works and operates pulling puppet strings behind some of the world leaders of the day. And all down through history. So that's an interesting thought. So, the history of the human race is synonymous with the history of great spiritual conflict. When we view world politics today, many of us wonder, why can't we just all come to the table and settle disputes in a peaceful fashion? To some extent, it seems to me that the gods and every caste of spiritual being beneath them seems intent on not being able to do what seems so common sense to humans. There was not a war in heaven. There's an ongoing conflict that makes the stuff of earthly battles seem insignificant. And it has been taking place since before the dawn of time itself. If any of you have ever watched the show, a little campy, Supernatural, Dean and Sam Winchester, the Winchester brothers. Carry on, my wayward son. You'll have peace when you are none. That show, when it dug deeply into its conflict between the angels, the angelic and the demonic, wasn't just fanciful stuff that somebody made up around some writing table. These were the things that are, trying to think of a good word, the cornerstones of the conflict in heaven. And that this war in the heavens constantly takes place on this planet, in the heavens, wherever else it takes place. And somebody, and perhaps a group of people, had their finger on the pulse of what's going on with the whole angelic issue, the whole demonic issue. And so it's interesting. John Zaffis insisted when he talked to me that you had your different castes of demons, just like you had your different castes of angels. Some were just thugs, stupid. They're there, they growl at you, they scratch you when you're doing paranormal investigations or whatever. That's the kind of thing. It's like, why do they do what they do? Well, they're thugs, they're idiots, they're stupid. And they probably wouldn't even be offended by my saying that. They're like, what? Shut up. And so, but your hierarchy then goes all the way up to those very sophisticated, very intelligent beings that operate and control and pull the strings of human history, if you will. You would think that the last place war would be is in heaven. Makes one wonder, says Joe Lee. Then again, remember, if you were here when we read that chapter, where I read from the book of Job, the oldest chronological book in the Bible. And it says that the gods were sitting around. Elohim was on his throne, and the gods were milling about. And the Satan, the article in front of his name, the Satan, came to accuse Job. And he says, you take everything away from this guy, he's going to curse you. And God said, go ahead, do it. So they're playing games with the lives of humans, just like the Olympians did. So it does make you wonder. Heaven wasn't such a nice place all the time. Okay, here we go. This section is called the demonology connection. It's interesting to note that so much of what we read in the biblical accounts of the first family and the subsequent books of the law revolve around sexuality and the encoded messages of adultery and sexual prohibition. Just pick up a Bible and read the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and you'll get the picture. You'll come out, pretty overwashed with sexual deeds, misconduct, and bloodshed. The subtext is rife with pictures of God's relationship to man taking on the tone of a marriage, any deviation from which would be adulterous. And adultery, in accordance with the biblical law, bore the punishment of death, but only for the woman, not for the man. How's that for a double standard for you? It's in this residual condemnation placed on the female because it was she who was tempted in the Garden of Eden, thereby bringing on the fall of mankind when she in turn tempted Adam. It is residual judgment of the woman who introduced the world to the Nephilim by sleeping with one of the watchers, Nakash, the serpent character in the garden, allowing the world to be corrupted by their offspring. Creation is sexual in nature. And if you don't believe that, you need to get out more. Whether it was simply lust, as the Genesis passage tells us, or the seeking of elemental power over creation, the heavenly beings were drawn to the sexuality of the humans. Don't try to define away the word lust as something other than its true intent, which is sexual in its basic, most primal etymology. Could it be also that so much of what we read in the biblical accounts of early mankind, the serpent in the garden, the watchers, the overtly sexually discriminating, gender-biased Mosaic law, are so sexually underwritten in their subtexts that they were created for the sole purpose of enforcing patriarchal rule? Think about that for a second. And was that patriarchal rule contrived out of scapegoating the female gender for all of mankind's spiritual woes? Were the questionably misogynistic mandates laid out for the early Christian church by the so-called Apostle Paul simply there for the intent of controlling women in first-century patriarchal Judean society? Or were they an adherence to what was, even then, the ancient notion that women needed to keep covered to prevent the temptation of angels and other spirit beings? It is clear that the Judeo-Christian scriptures contain a resounding undertone of sexual prohibition that can trace its foundations back to the role that women played in the downfall of man and the corruption and destruction of the world by the Nephilim. Clearly, it is the sexual promiscuity of women that brought on the great woes of the world, and clearly the undercode of sexual prohibition is there to remind them of their follies and keep them suppressed as punishment for their gender-driven acts. The watchers were not only the ones placed under lock and key when God imposed judgment on the world, so were the women of the human race. Make no mistake, it was the early church fathers who first said that the angels and the other spirit beings were sexless. The church fathers said that, not the Bible. This is a completely fabricated extra-biblical notion. Scripture never states that angels and demons cannot engage in sex. The highly quoted passage in Matthew 22:30 has Jesus telling his followers that angels do not marry. He doesn't, however, say that they're incapable of sex. And the context of his words in this passage focus on the righteous angels, not the unrighteous demons. The entire contextual point of Christ's argument is that people will not marry in heaven. He is not particularly discussing the sexual habits of angels. And the theology of not marrying in heaven is not something we're going to deal with today. There is something more to all of this, something deeper. Some alien conspiracy theorists contend that the church has been silent about UFOs and abductions, and about alien hybridization, fetus thefts, and the impregnation of women by these beings. Yet all along the church has spoken out as loudly as any other voice in that it has a complete doctrine built around the infiltration and interference of the demonic on humanity. And it all stems from the very first impregnation of Eve in the garden by the character known as the serpent, Nakash. It was he who fathered Cain, the first of the Nephilim. This act was repeated throughout all of antediluvial humanity until God had had enough and there was judgment. According to Roman Catholic Church doctrine, the fallen have been attempting to breed the perfect hybrid offspring of spirit and human since the time of the resurgence of humanity onto the still damp floodplains of ancient Mesopotamia. In accordance with Roman Catholic systematic theology, and in the simplest of terms, God keeps demons on a pretty short leash. They can do nothing without his consent or allowance. The account of the descent of the Watchers is not to be misconstrued as demonic attempts at breeding with human women. The Watchers of which we have seen were not demonics, nor were they fallen angels. They were the minor gods of the divine council who left their first estate and descended to their charges, the humans, to interbreed with them in the judgment imposed on them as hinted at in Psalm 82, when they were stripped of their immortality and died like mortal men. Take that all in. Put that all in your pipe and smoke it for a minute. Got it? Now, from genetic hybrid to demon. Now, before I do that, men don't perform well after imbibing spirits. Great point, Suze. I know that it sure drops our inhibitions to ask, though. PK says, I know that Satan was an angel that was thrown out of heaven, but I thought that he couldn't re-enter heaven. But he can and does. Seems unfair. I don't know if he does or not. It calls him the Satan, that he entered the courts of heaven, kind of like Hades did with the Olympians. I still think of James Wood voicing the Hades character in the Disney cartoon Hercules that came out 25 years ago. I love he's got the blue flame as his hair. I love that somebody blew out his hair and he goes, "Who blew out my hair?" You remember that character? It was great. So Jeannie says Judy, June, Jeannie, and Joe. Jolie, not necessarily in that order. There you go. Let's see. Wine, spirits were made so that the spirits can have sex. Pretty much, Delaney. Why no female angels getting pregnant? You know, I've wondered about that question. Doesn't seem to be any female angels. It seems like God was pretty, I don't know, was he misogynistic himself? He created these beings. Perhaps they were, I don't know. I'm not even going to speculate on that because I don't know the theological answer to that. Why did God only make male angels? Well, maybe there are. Next section in this chapter. And by the way, we are on the last chapter of the book. From genetic hybrid to demon. Although it's commonplace in Judeo-Christian circles to believe that demons are simply the angels who rebelled against God and were cast to the earth, the book of Enoch gives us a very different alternative to that tradition. It says in Enoch 15, 8 through 12, and now the giants, listen to this. This is really interesting stuff. And now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh, that's the celestial beings and human women, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth. And on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men and from holy watchers, is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall they be their dwelling. But as for the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth, and the earth shall be their dwelling, and the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men, and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. All right. The Enochian passage is implicit. It's the spirits of the Nephilim killed in the great flood of Noah that are the demonic forces dwelling on the earth today. If you're part of a paranormal group, or if you've read or heard or witnessed the story of exorcisms and demonic behavior and so on, evil spirits, this is a bit of a link to some of the things you've seen or experienced. That the evil spirits that are alive on the earth today are the spirits that were the spirits of the dead Nephilim that died in the flood. So says Enoch. And because they were fathered by spirit beings, now let's see, it was here on earth that they were born, and it's here on the earth they died. And because they were fathered by spirit beings, Enoch tells us that they will forever dwell on the earth in form of the evil spirits. The ghosts of the Nephilim, if you will, are the demonic host who have plagued humanity throughout the ages. The offspring of the Watchers and human women were disruptive, corrupt, and evil in nature, and that's why the divine sent a great flood to wipe them out. Evidently, in spirit form, they are no different. The spirits of the Nephilim are the great harassers of mankind. They are the true fallen, those who came down, those who descended, those who fell. They troubled mankind to the point of watery judgment imposed by the supreme God, and they continue in spirit form to commit evil against humanity. The Watchers are not fallen angels, as we have established already in this book, but their offspring, whose mix of extraterrestrial and human DNA made them unique on the earth, and they've become the spiritual hounds of hell who torment the living. And they continue wreaking havoc on the earth and in the lives of humans even today. I've got a picture of Lilith here, a statue of Lilith. Why do I have her here? The earliest known representation of Lilith, this is the caption on the photo, Sumerian, circa 1950 BCE. The famous relief from the old Babylonian period, not in the British Museum, called the Burney relief or the Queen of the Night relief. The depicted figure could be an aspect of Ishtar, Mesopotamian goddess of sexual love and war. However, her bird-like feet and accompanying owls has suggested to some a connection with Lilitu, called Lilith in the Bible, though seemingly not the usual demonic Lilitu. That's the photo. We'll see. We're probably going to hit her a little bit here. There she is, all her glory. You want to say, if you're a guy, you want to say, what a rack. Woo! Sorry, ladies. So the next section, sleeping with the enemy. In the Gilgamesh epic, the god-man Gilgamesh, his father, is listed as Lilu, and he is one of the earliest mentions of an incubus. The story hails from ancient Mesopotamia and is found in the Sumerian king list, 2400 BCE, where it is said that Lilu seduced women in their sleep and had sex with them. At the same time, Lilitu, or Lilith, as you just read, a female demon, appeared to men in their erotic dreams. Both Lilu and Lilitu strove to fulfill their sexual desires and create demonic offspring. Regarding Lilith, and I've got the Hebrew word in here, herself, she is a character found in Jewish mythology, mentioned earliest in the Babylonian Talmud, documents compiled between the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era. In Jewish folklore, during the 8th, no, that can't be. That has to be BCE, and it's a typo. The Babylonian Talmud. In Jewish folklore, during the 8th to 10th centuries, it says of the Common Era, or AD, Lilith became known as Adam's first wife. And this mythology developed into a widely accepted view among the Jews of the Middle Ages. As the legend became more refined and expanded, the 13th century writings of Rabbi Isaac ben Jacob Elfasi HaKohen had Lilith leaving Adam, refusing to return to Eden after she had refused to become subservient to him. She later mated with the archangel Samael. Now there's two spirit beings getting it on. The resulting Lilith legend is still found in modern Western culture, literature, occultism, fantasy, and even in horror. And she was even become a cult favorite in the spiritist feminist community. It's said in some traditions that Lilith, taking the form of a male, was actually the serpent in the garden who seduced Eve, and then went on to seduce Adam with grave consequence. Now, that's just some trains of thought, because the name is there, Nakosh, unless she took that name as the male version of herself. And the serpent, the woman of harlotry, incited and seduced Eve through the husks of light, which in itself is holiness. And the serpent seduced holy Eve, and enough said for him who understands. And all this ruination came about because Adam, the first man, coupled with Eve while she was in her menstrual impurity. This is the fifth and the impure seed of the serpent, who mounted Eve before Adam mounted her. Some great old archaic language there. Behold, here it is before you. Because of the sins of Adam, the first man, all the things mentioned came into being. For evil Lilith, when she saw the greatness of his corruption, became strong in her husks, and came to Adam against his will, and became hot from him, and bore him many demons and spirits, and Lilin. That is from, let's see where that's from. Give me a second here. That is footnote 6 for this final chapter. I'll tell you where that's from. Who wrote that? Gonna find it. Gonna find it. Gonna find it. Gonna find it. It's a bibliography. Here it is. Chapter 10. 6th footnote. Oh, that's Patai, the Hebrew goddess. Patai, I'm Jewish scholar. All right. It was the offspring of Lilith by Adam that was said in this tradition to have become the host of demons. This is really the birth of the modern understanding of the incubus and the succubus, demonic beings who sleep with humans for the purpose of satiating some innate sexual drive and for the purpose of creating spirit offspring. In the Christian tradition, there existed a huge debate over the veracity of demonic influence, especially when it came to discussions over the incubi and succubi. St. Augustine, a Roman philosopher and theologian who lived in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, touched on this topic in his work, The City of God. Sounding much like alien abduction believers today, Augustine said that there were too many attacks by incubi to deny their existence. There is, quote, a very general rumor, which many have verified by their own experience, or which trustworthy persons who have heard the experience of others corroborate, that sylvans and fauns, who are commonly called incubi, had often made wicked assaults upon women. 800 years later, Thomas Aquinas, disputing the reproductive abilities of the incubi as they were, in his account, fallen angels, therefore incapable of sexual reproduction, wrote, "Still, if some are occasionally begotten from demons, it's not from the seed of such demons, nor from their assumed bodies, but from the seed of men taken for the purpose, as when the demon assumes first the form of a woman and afterwards of a man, just as they take the seed of other things for other generating purposes." That was his explanation. He said a succubus will, pardon the pun, will come to a guy, have sex with him, and then take the seed from that copulation, turn into the form of an incubus, a male demon, have sex with a woman, and impregnate her. So in essence, he's saying Demons don't impregnate, incubus and succubus don't, but they carry the seed from one human to another human and do that. I don't know why that would make the seed, the offspring, evil in any way, shape, or form. According to the Malleus Maleficarum, Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch's Hammer, written by Helmut Kramer in 1486, a succubus will have sex with a human male in order to collect semen from the men she seduces. I hope you're all grown-ups here and can handle this language. She then gives give us an R rating tonight. She then gives it to the incubi, or male demons, who then use the semen to impregnate human females, thus explaining how demons could apparently sire children despite the traditional belief that they were incapable of reproduction. Children so begotten were known as cambions, and were supposed to be those who were born deformed or more susceptible to supernatural influences. The Malleus Maleficarum does not address the obvious issue. Why a human female impregnated with semen of a human male would not produce normal, healthy human offspring, even if the mode of delivery was being carried by a demon. Of course, it's also widely believed that the Malleus Maleficarum, written during the period of the Inquisition's greatest power, is nothing more than a work of misogyny. It holds women as the main culprits of evil. Notice how that came out naturally, not evil, but evil. Women are the main source of evil. I lost my place on that. It holds the women as the main culprits of evil and perpetrators of witchcraft. By the way, the Malleus Maleficarum, I think, was addressed in the Salem witch trials, not long after it was written. It holds women as the main culprits of evil and the perpetrators of witchcraft. The book also claims that women are much more susceptible to demonic influence, as they are weaker in faith than men, and more apt to get carnal. Carnal being the word for evil concupiscence. In other words, what the Malleus Maleficarum is promoting is that more. And the author also put forward the notion that most women accused as witches were guilty of, quote, possessing strong personalities, end quote, and were known to defy convention by overstepping the lines of, quote, proper female decorum, end quote. So all my women friends here tonight, ask yourself, do you operate under proper female decorum? Do you possess a strong personality? Well, then you may just be fodder for sexual demonic activity. Whether or not any of the information on the demonic activity is found within the pages of the Malleus bears any resemblance to the truth of the matter, it's very hard to decipher, especially when obfuscated by the persecution and the political maneuverings of those who were in control of the masses at the time of its writing. When one steps back outside the box, it all starts to take on a tone of so much ridiculous surmising and storytelling, and works such as the Malleus Maleficarum do little to dispel the notion that so much of this is pure fiction. And, you just wondered, weren't there times, you think of the Salem witch trials and the loss of life there and the accusations, don't you think somebody could just step up and slap those judges in the face and say, shut up, bitch? But this is what their whole community thrived on this. This was the stuff that drove them beneath the surface. So everybody was afraid to do that until finally it took hold. Do the demonic spirits of the Nephilim have sex with humans to continue to propagate a species of mixed blood spirit beings? It seems that even in death, the offspring of the Watchers continues to perpetrate their raging corruption of humanity. Of course, there's very little of this that can be proven by any sort of physical evidence. So it once again is all governed by the tone of what you choose to believe about any of this, folks. And it all sounds so fanciful and the stuffs of dark imaginings It's no wonder the scientific community shuns the slightest notion of any of this stuff. You ever think about that, or think about that for a second? All of this stuff we're talking about is religious mythology, and that's what we're examining here. Trying to compare it to alien mythos, to other modern forms of religious mythology. And the big question is, does it really exist? Did it really happen? We talk about it when we talk about these things as if it did, because we're just talking about it. So it would be very interesting to know what you think about that. To end up this chapter now, before we hit the conclusion, this is the last half a page, the paranormal. There's a great and grave fascination with demons amongst modern paranormal hobbyists. The surge of ghost hunting and paranormal investigation throughout the last decade, spurred on by the success of pop cultural live-action paranormal television, has fostered a rise in interest in demons and demonology, the study of evil spirits and their influence on people. However, with the rise of pop cultural influence also comes the rise in pop cultural application. And the vast majority of so-called demonologists operating today have little knowledge of what it is they claim to be, and little ability to enact on the behalf of those tormented by demonic spirits. Having an interest in the demonic is not the same thing as having experience with helping people who are in bondage to these beings. I've known several people who have been exorcists or participated in them. And I had an old pastor friend of mine. His name was John Larson. We called him Parson Larson. And he gave a story of, I was sitting in the office talking to them one day, and at the church, and he told of, I don't know what brought up the topic, but of demonic exorcism. And he says, buddy, he says, I was part of one once, and he says, I never want to be part of one again. That is not my calling. And the assistant pastor who worked with him, younger man, said, Scotty, I was there, and he says, the most terrifying experience I ever went through, and I will never do it again. And apparently he told me his story was, they had this little woman, middle-aged, I think she was, and it took 5-6 guys to hold her down as she was doing what you see on the television. The growling, the frothing at the mouth, the cursing them all, the picking them up and throwing them around. And then my friend, the assistant pastor there, said, Scott, he said, when I was standing there, he says, helping, he says, this demonically possessed woman looked me right in the eyes. And he says, you could see it, he says, it was like something out of a movie, and started reciting all my private sins, my private things that I would never tell anybody about. And he said it was humiliating and embarrassing. He says, but the exorcist said, just ignore them, move on, blah, blah, blah. We're all going to go through this. And he said it was the most terrifying thing he had ever experienced. And my pastor said, I'm never going to do it again. They were there to help. And so there's some very real experiences out there. And I'm going to tell you, this might be a good place before the last 2 paragraphs here. I was at Gettysburg with the ghost hunters back a good 10 years ago, 11 maybe, back when I was working with them on their magazine. And we went to the Farnsworth house. It was Amy Bruni and Britt Griffith and me and Aaron Sagers and Adam Bly. And there was a place where they were, the people who owned the house called the catacombs. And in the Farnsworth house, during the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg, there were snipers that were up in the attic. And they would shoot down on the Union Army. And you can still see today when you visit. It's a landmark there now, and it's part of downtown Gettysburg. The brick walls are all pockmarked with bullet holes, and 5 Union soldiers died upstairs. I'm sorry, Confederate soldiers, snipers died upstairs in the attic. And there's more stories. They talk about the place being very haunted and very creepy. And there was a guy that owned the house. His last name was Sweeney. And he would have sex with his daughters and impregnate them. And if the baby was born, he would take the baby once it was born and he would kill it and bury it in the walls down in what they now call the catacombs. And apparently, after his death, his wife went to the county and reported all of this. And of course, they exhumed all the bodies of the little children. This is a known fact in the county, with the county seat there. It's part of their history. Dark history, but it's there. It's not just an urban myth. So we're sitting down. They opened up, they went through a broom closet to get us there. And in the back of the broom closet was a big steel door. They had all locked up. And it was Aaron Sagers, Adam Bly, and I. And we went into that catacomb area, what they call the catacomb. Very low ceiling, maybe about 5 to 6 feet. You felt like you had to do this. And the walls were the old stonework in a very small, tight spot. And we sat down there. And Adam Bly was one of my friends who is a demonologist, assists with exorcists, but very Roman Catholic, believes he can't participate in exorcism because he's not a priest. But he is one of these fellows who is flown to the Vatican to lecture and teach priests and bishops about exorcism and demonology. So we're sitting down there with him, and Adam's he was a good friend and very deadpan in the way he talks and things. Big, tall, bald guy. And so he says, yeah, I feel the presence of children here, and they're asking for help. And he says, I think I'll stay tonight and pray for them. And say, that one's very dark. You, he said, and he put his hand out, he says, you cannot interfere. You have to go away. And he says, when I pray for these kids, he says, there's children. And so Aaron and I kind of, okay. Well, we went out back into the main area of the basement. And some good friends of mine who are both no longer living. You may have heard of them. You may know who they are. Debbie and Mark Constantino, I'm sorry. And a tragic story with them a couple of years ago. But they were specialists with EVPs. And I went up to Debbie and I said, they had a group of people they were doing a demo for with the EVPs. And I went up and I said, Debbie, would you ask if there's a Mr. Sweeney here? And she said, yeah, I'll do that. And so they had a demo and they had all their equipment set up to tape and record for EVPs. Adam and Aaron and I went to the back of the room, and we're just kind of leaning back there on the pillar and listening and watching. And she said, we're going to do a little experiment. And she starts recording, and she said, we're going to ask for a Mr. Sweeney to come forward. And she pauses. She asks a couple of other questions. And they go about 2.5 to 3 minutes. She says, let's play that back over the speakers and see if we got anything. So she plays this back, and you hear her on the speaker say, is there anybody here? And you hear children crying. And they're saying, help us, save us from the Father. I mean, I swear to you, folks, now this is my story. When I hear a lot of people's stories like this, I'm like, bullshit. But I was there. I saw it happening and heard it with my own ears. And these children crying. And if that wasn't bad enough, help us, save us from the Father. A growling voice came over them. Rah, like that, almost. Like a person doing it. Not like an animal growling. It's like a person going, gah, gah. And then you hear Debbie's voice say, because we're not hearing of this, any of this while they're recording, and Debbie's voice says, "Is there a Mr. Sweeney here?" And the voice says, "I'm Sweeney." Ah, ah. And you hear the children voices crying, wailing in the background. And then out of the blue, the Sweeney voice says, calls out Adam. "Adam Bly, don't you fucking tell me what to do." So remember, when we were in there, he said, "The darkness, you can go away." And I got to tell you, when you hear that stuff firsthand coming out and you experience, you watched it being recorded, and then there it is. You go, whoa. And Adam, he's standing there with his arms crossed, kind of leaning on the pillar, and he looks over at me and he goes, "Oh, it doesn't sound too happy." He's so deadpan. And so I go, "No, he doesn't." So he says, "I'm going to stay here tonight and pray." And he stayed there all night and prayed for kids. In his way of believing things, he was praying for those kids to depart and that God would take them from that place. So this was something I saw up close and personal, or I'd have trouble believing it. But this is what we're talking about here with all of this. There's this great and grave fascination in paranormal investigation with the demonic, but we don't know what we're playing with. Maybe they are demons. Maybe we don't know that for sure. Interdimensional characters, something. There's something there, though. I've had far too fucking many experiences, pardon my French, to discount that there is not something there, or to discount that there's something there. I've seen it too much firsthand. There are things, like my old pastor said, things I don't want to get involved with. I don't care. And there are some people with bravado that says, "I can handle it. I'm going to go in and mess with these demons." You know what? Good for you. Have a good time. So here's the question. Well, this last paragraph I read before I got into all that sidetrack stuff. Having an interest in the demonic is not the same as having experience with helping people who are in bondage to these things. Something I've always said when investigating claims of ghosts and encountering the spirit world, and I've done this with Rocky. If Rocky's still in the room, he knows exactly what I'm talking about, and some of the things that we've experienced are, as Rocky would tell you, some of the most terrifying things he's ever experienced. We've witnessed some pretty harsh stuff. And something I've always said when investigating claims of ghosts and encountering the spirit world is that you never know who you're really talking to, really. Without making a case for the existence of human ghosts, suffice it to say that it is more often than not that a demon will deceive you into believing it's the ghost of a dead human, rather than an actual encounter with those who have passed on and are still roaming the hallways and attics of old houses and abandoned insane asylums. I just got chills running all up the backs of my arms. Because in the back of my head I was thinking of some encounters. The evil spirits encountered in demonological setting are the spirits of the Nephilim, who died in the Great Flood. Are the Nephilim among us today? Most certainly. In both physical remnants that have bred into the bloodlines of the human race and the ghostly presence and influence of the Nephilim demonics. That's the end of the final chapter. I'm going to move on to the conclusion. I'm going to tell you, there was an experience I had with it's back in 2006. So we're talking 13 years ago. And somebody I know very well in my adult life who didn't know anything about me as a kid. I had dated a young girl in high school. She was 2 years behind me. I was younger than my class by a year. So I was 16. She was 15. We were 2 years apart in school. I was a senior. She was a freshman or sophomore. And we were madly in love. We were going to get married, of course, just like it always was. And when I went off to college, we just parted ways. There was nothing negative, nothing bad. I just entered a whole new world. Her world was back home. She wasn't pining away after me. I wasn't pining away after her. We just went our separate ways. And we didn't even break up, really. We just went different directions. And we were kids. And several years later, I bumped into her at the church where I was attending, and I was already married, and I had no kids yet. That was my first wife. And met her at church, and she eagerly made her way over, and we got to talking. She was married, so on and so forth. And a few years went by. That was in the 80s. And I heard right around 1990, what year would it have been? Mid-90s, a friend of mine who knew her parents said, "Did you hear that Tammy died?" I said, "No, I hadn't heard that." And apparently, now Tammy was also was very diabetic. This is back in the early days of understanding diabetes in the 70s, you know, and she was insulin dependent back when you had to shoot it up in your own, you know, and all of that, and not the meds we have today. And she apparently had, in childbirth, had contracted, because of her diabetes, an even worse, I don't know how you get worse diabetes, but it killed her, is what it did. And so that would have been, she would have died right around 1992. And so fast forward several years, now 2006, we're talking between 13 and 14 years later. And I had this friend of mine who was a witch, and her mother was a witch. There was lots of activity at my house, and Rainey can attest to that because I was dating Rainey at the time. And this older witch said, "Scotty, every time I come into your house, I feel like there's the presence of a jealous woman here." Now you know where I'm going with this. And Rainey experienced lots of spiritual activity in that house. Rainey just attracts the shit like you wouldn't believe. And she would see beings and so on. And so my friend, who was the witch, and her mom, the witch, came to do some readings in the house and see what they could find. And she was doing a pendulum reading. Now, the mother knew nothing about me. The daughter was a good friend. They didn't know anything about my high school days. I mean, I was already in my 40s at this time, my mid-40s. And she was doing a pendulum reading. It was spelling out words. And she said, "Is there anybody here?" And she finds out there's ghosts, there's spirits. She said, "Could anybody give me their name? If you're a human ghost, could you give me your name?" And it spelled out Tamara Barnhart. And the girl I dated was Tammy Barnhart. And I got to tell you, I sat back. We were all sitting on the big bed in the bedroom and doing this pendulum reading. Rainey didn't even know who Tammy Barnhart was. And I got chills literally from my head to my toe. I mean, just like I'd never felt it. That's pins and needles all over. And I looked and I said, "Do you know who Tammy Barnhart is?" And then I explained who she was. And Kay asked, "How long have you been in spirit form?" And it said 13 years. Which was, at that time, about 13 years since she had died. Through the pendulum reading and through Kay, who was psychic, got that this young woman's spirit said she had been with me for all that time. And I had another psychic medium who knew nothing of this story, who said, "I see a very dark woman, very, not dark," she said, "sad, regrets, lost, that's connected to you here, has followed you around." And so stuff like this, you wonder about that. Yeah, I get goosebumps myself right now, Michelle, telling the tale. So you wonder about this stuff. And who are we talking to really? I remember at the time I started asking through Kay, asking questions of this Tamara to see if she could answer the right answers. And I wasn't getting any of the right answers. Her father was one of the seminary professors at the school, at the church where I went. And I asked, what was her father's profession, and said farmer. Now, very possible, I heard he left the ministry and went into other stuff, moved back to West Virginia. May have very well been a farmer, I don't know. But anyway, there's the story. So, info comes from the Pendulum and Divining Rods. Diabetes, Brian. Let's see. That's your. I got my own rods right here. By the way, since we talked about them, before we get to the conclusion, these are the ones that John Ward had made for me in Egypt. And they were made by a local artisan. I don't use them enough that I feel I'm very familiar with them. They're hard to hold and hard to handle, but this is the way John learned, and it's the way he taught me, was to just hold them like this, and they would do their thing. And so if I held them the way John showed me, I would hold them like this. And I would say, can you show me a yes by crossing? Oh, see, there you go. And if you watch my hands, I'm not doing anything with my hands. Thank you very much. I haven't picked them up in quite a while. Could you show me a no? And the no is where you spread them apart. And straightforward is also a non-answer. Let's try that again. Could you spread the rods apart to show me a no? Yes. I'm holding them right. All right, we saw them cross for yes. What do they do? It's a long explanation to get into the rods. Taps into spirits. They use divining rods to find water, stuff like that. And relax the hands. And I'm not standing. I would be standing up and holding these a bit lower. So, and I haven't used them for so long. But if I were to ask the question, are the Nephilim on the earth today? Can you tell me yes or no? I get nothing. I've got to practice with them is what I got to do. Could you tell me, are the Nephilim on the earth today? Yes or no? It's not doing anything. It's the practitioner, not the rods. Because when I used to use them, sometimes if I switch them around, they work much better. Could you tell me in a yes or no, are there Nephilim on the earth today? Yeah, I'm not holding them right. I'm not doing it right. Rainey has a... Oh, wait. Yeah, they were starting to separate. Are there Nephilim on the earth today was my question. Thank you. Could you show me one more time? If there are Nephilim on the earth today, could you show me yes or no? And I feel them spreading apart. There, you can see that. It's saying no. So interesting. That's what the rods do. I have to get Jeff to do that for me. All right, let's do this. Before we go too much far afield, a few more pages for the conclusion of this book, and then we'll be done with this book. So, yeah, I've got to spend my time with them, Brian Parker says. Yeah, I do. John is a professional with them. He teaches them. I don't spend enough time with them. I've had them do very interesting things for me when I would use them more often. Now they've just been sitting pretty much for a couple of years. The conclusion of the rise and fall of the Nephilim. As you've been able to see by now, the story of the Nephilim is not a simple one. Recounting the actual biblical tale, including the various accounts from other ancient books, could comprise a page or two in a book such as this. But attempting to dig a little deeper to gain a richer understanding of what's behind the story, along with its historical and future ramifications, is what transforms it into a much bigger account. The descent of the Watchers to humanity is no small isolated myth. It has far-reaching tendrils that dip into the subterranean flow of every culture and even life itself on this planet. Of course, there is a modicum of faith required to make the connections, just as there is a leaping the great chasms that lie between the mileposts on the evolutionary chain established by science. And as, well, you remember we referred to that at the beginning of the book, and as with the scientific research of the ascendancy of mankind, there are no quantitative facts that link it all together, simply stepping stones from one discovery to the next. As I said at the very beginning of the book, we have a pile of stones here, but that pile does not make a house until it's all mortared together. And sometimes that mortar is mixed pretty thinly in order to make exponential leaps to fill the missing data. There is so much to surmise and such significant amounts of subjective extrapolation, that the true story and all its details may never be known to modern humanity. But the fact that something indeed happened many thousands of years ago is incontrovertible. Whether you're a believer in the religious writings of the Bible and its apocryphal companions, or whether you're in strict adherence to the scientific code that allows for nothing to exist beyond what is provable in the here and now, humanity bears the marks and scars of interference on both a historic scope as well as in our bloodlines. That's where we find ourselves flipping the intellectual coin of subjectivity into the air, wondering if the answer is as simple as heads it's so, tails it's not. I've already begun to garner criticism on my religious views as expressed in this book, and I'm sure there is much more to come as those ideas of mine as mixed into the examination of these unearthly beings makes their appointed rounds to the minds of those who crack the covers of this book. I'm sure to be taken to task by some for my translations of the ancient texts, as there are so many, and I would say interpretations rather than translations, as there are so many good scholars who have done the groundwork beneath my feet, and from whom I have gleaned bits and pieces of information. Though not intending to make any enemies in the Jewish and Christian camps, I'm sure I have offended some sensibilities when addressing the religious tone of these topics. And I know I will draw some concern for the safety of my immortal soul from those who will see my words as damning Christianity and thumbing my nose at the monotheistic God of the Bible. But those actions on my part would be the farthest thing from the truth. I am simply grasp on what I believe about the Watchers and the Nephilim. There have been great tolls taken on my faith, and even greater questions burning in my brain. Perhaps one might think that my faith must not have been very strong to begin with, if a little historical buffeting could shake it up a bit, but I would differ with you on that assessment. For my faith was very strong during my early years and my subsequent Bible college and seminary training. But the older I get and the further away I travel from those days of innocence, the more difficult it becomes to trust in a God who resembles so many other mythological characters, many of whom preceded him in the historical record. So what I want to leave you with, as a result of reading this book, is a better understanding of who the Nephilim are, where they come from, why they're important to understanding the great ebbing and flowing undercurrent of humanity. I want you to have gleaned an understanding that although stories may be told, and stories may be stories, there is usually a kernel of truth at their core that is a much bigger story than what you could have imagined. To me, my study of the story of the Nephilim has emerged as an eye-opening encounter with beings who are living and breathing around us every day of our lives. Their activities have great bearing on the whole of humanity and the course of world events. They once were so influential that they brought about the end of the world. The big question is whether or not they're having that same influence yet again. It's up to you to determine what you want to believe about these beings. Were they the descendants of the minor gods of heaven? Were they the offspring of alien encounters with humanity? Either path bears little proof beyond the obvious earmarks of interpretation. Determining just who and what did the interpreting is at the core of the big questions of life. If nothing else, I hope this book provided you with an informative and, in the grandest of hopes, open the doors to deeper consideration and the asking of even greater questions. It's my belief that there exist out there beings much greater than ourselves. Perhaps not greater in reason or compassion, but greater in the sense that they hold a power that was strong enough to create us, and then strong enough to manipulate our genetics and bloodlines. It's my belief that there is a great universal spirituality that resembles nothing like that which we've been taught or have conceived in our wildest fictions. The Nephilim rose to dominance on the earth as the children of a mixed race of superior beings and human women. They, as all things do, degraded and became corrupt. But their decay and decadence were on as grandiose a scheme as their unnatural origins. They wreaked havoc and tragedy and catastrophic corruption among humankind. Then they fell in the great judgment imposed by the King of all that exists, only to return in the form of pure evil. If all this sounds like the stuffs of myth, you'd be correct in your assessment. For all myth begins to merge at the edges, blending into a massive, blurred picture of the great cosmic narrative underpinning the foundation and origin of the universe. The saddest part of all of that is that myth is not testable. It is not logical, and it rarely makes sense in light of scientific methodology. The Nephilim came, they conquered, they decayed, they fell. And they're still with us to this very day. The big question is in asking yourself what you can and cannot believe. And the greatest responsibility we all have is squaring the circle. Then as the epilogue, I put this verse from the book of Job, 8:8-9. For inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, and prepare thyself to the search of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday, and know nothing, because our days upon the earth are but a shadow. The end. There you go. The rise and fall of the Nephilim. There's a lot of stuff to ponder and think about. And I want to take a look at what you guys were all writing. Where did I get the rods? These are the rods that, as I mentioned, that John Ward had made for me in Egypt. These were made by a local artisan in Egypt. They're I don't know what they are. Metal. So I've used them a few times. They've been very effective for me a few times. And I just let up. I find that if I ever want them to be effective, I have to work with them for a while before I get something good. So, June, you're welcome. Thank you. I'm glad you found interest in all this stuff. Yep, John Ward, Michelle. Good friend of mine. Let's see. Let me go back. It's a fascinating read. Thank you. Frances says she's an empath. And she'll get to work around them, but the rods can still talk to her. That's good. Let's see. If Christians really want to get upset, they should read Lawrence Gardner. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, in my next book on the reptilians, I quoted him in several places. Brian says he'll give me his link. All right. Pendulums and rods are electronics. You need to charge them. Yes. These have been in a box. Pardon me. Now, these have been in a box for most of the last 2 years. And I found them the other day and took them out. The rods are like a woman. They only work well for you if you take them out once in a while. So that's Michelle. That's my paraphrase of what you said. Yes, I have to put my mind and attention to them. You're right. Let's see. There's probably a lot of stuff in here going backwards. You guys have. I didn't look. That's one fault of mine with this. I get into the reading and into the talking, and I don't look over at the chat room quite as much as I ought to. I hope Rocky's feeling better too, Jeannie. Yeah, he's had a rough month, really. So, Brian Parker, I don't know that much French. Don't mess with demons. Yep. No denying when it happens to you. Michelle asked earlier, you're unaware of the Constantines and what happened. Those of you who knew who Debbie and Mark were, they were very well known in the paranormal field. They were EVP specialists. And as a matter of fact, there was one time we were at Waverly Hills, the asylum or the sanatorium in Lexington, Kentucky. And I was up in their room, and we were smoking up there because we could, and they got a smoking room. And Debbie had this old doll, like 100-year-old plus doll, that they used to do recordings and get voices from this doll. And it would communicate with them and talk to them. And I can't remember his name. I think it was Charlie. But we're sitting in their room having a cigarette. And I'm sitting straddling the arm of the sofa. And Debbie says, Scotty, have you ever met Charlie? And I said, no, I haven't. She said, well, let me go get him. And Mark started setting up the recording. He says, let's do a little EVP session with him. So she brought out this old doll and male doll, set him on the sofa next to him. It's about this tall, 2 feet, not quite 2 feet tall. And she pulls out a little recorder, and she said, okay, I'm going to turn this on. And she says our names and the date. She says, so I'm going to talk to Charlie. And she says, hi, Charlie, how are you? How was your flight? She pauses. You have to pause for answers if they come. And she said, this is our friend Scotty. I want to introduce you to him. And a couple of questions. She went for about 2 minutes. Just 2-3 questions. And then she turned it off. She said, let's see if we picked anything up from him today. And so she plays back this recorder. This is all right in front of me. She's just sitting on the coffee table right in front of the sofa. Charlie's next to me, the doll. Mark is over here just with the no, he didn't have the recorder. He was messing. He was just standing there. I mixed up that story. He wasn't doing anything in the recording because she had the little one in her hand. And so he's standing there, and I'm straddling the arm of the sofa, and the doll's next to me. So she turns on the recorder, and you hear her voice, hi, Charlie, how are you? Oh, I'm fine. Comes back this crinkly little voice, like a little old man. And I looked at the doll. I said, pardon my French. That's what you were referring to, Brian. I said, you're fucking kidding me. And it kept playing, and she goes, how was your flight? Oh, a little crowded. Because they had them all wrapped up in a suitcase. And then she said, this is my friend Scotty. I want to introduce you to him. Oh, hey, Scotty. Just like that. And I stood up. I wasn't scared. I was just like, you are fucking pulling my leg. You are shitting me, I think was my response. I was fully intrigued, fully on board with the intrigue. And we did a little bit more with that, but that's Mark and Debbie Constantino. That's what they did for a living. And what I know, it's a sad story. They were very close. I take that back. I don't want to make it stronger than it was. We were close friends. Debbie wanted me to come out to Alcatraz with them one year, and I said, I don't know if I can get away. And she said, we'll pay for you if you come out. We'd love to have you there, and so on and so on. And so we were close enough that we talked a lot. And apparently, and I don't know all the conflict, but Mark, in a jealous rage, accusing her of things, they were having a bad marriage. He shot her and killed her, and he killed himself. And that was, what was that, 3-4 years ago now? And it just shocked because I remember hearing it in the news, and I didn't know their name. They hadn't mentioned their names yet. And, paranormal couple, killed in a homicide, suicide, and Mark and Debbie Constantino. And I went, No. So that's who they were, Michelle. And Suze, no, it wasn't ventriloquism. I would have heard them the way the recorder would have picked them up if they were doing ventriloquist acts. There you go. That's who they were. Sad story. It's still sad. You know, it's only raw because you knew who these people were. And it was so senseless. And but there it is. So there's the Nephilim. I hope you enjoyed this reading. I am going to let's see. I might have one right here. I don't. I'm going to also, I want to do a reading from Reptilians and also from Exodus. Now, this was John Ward's in my book, The Exodus Reality. It was unearthing the real history of Moses, identifying the pharaohs, and examining the Exodus from Egypt. And we present our two different views in this book. Matter of fact, there's John and I in front of the Sphinx back in 2013 when we wrote this. And it's a neat book. It's our little travelogue. I mean, it's full of pictures and all the stuff that we did there, maps. And it's got, I always say this for the guys, it's got color pictures. So, you know, we've got these color sections in there of things like this. You know, there we are at the Colossi of Memnon. And I'll give you some ideas of what's in the book. The sacred lakes. There's John. This is the shrine of Alexander the Great at Karnak temples. Maps, places. This is John and I when we were at I took that picture of him at the pyramids. And so we have a temple he built for her in the, remember I told the tale of being there? No, I might not have told that while we were reading this book. But that was her shrine in the Theban Mountains. Right on the other side of those cliffs is the Valley of the Kings. This was the female pharaoh, Hatshepsut, while Moses, I believed as Senenmut, grew up in Egypt. So these are all the places. Amenhotep II, talk about that's his shrine at Karnak. And John and I were guests of Sheikh Barakat. And we climbed Serabat el Khadim, which we both believe to be the mountain of God, where Moses went up, got the 10 Commandments, where the golden calf took place down on the desert floor, and all of that. And there's reasons for that. The reasons we believe that. This is the place. That's just John and I at Karnak Temple Complex. So all of this, it's a fun book. But I want to read this one too. But I didn't write the whole thing because John wrote half of it on his stuff and the guy that he believes was Moses, and I wrote on my guy. I also have the Reptilians. But I'm not going to just jump tomorrow into starting another book. I'm going to do some commentary and do my own little radio show and do more stuff with Rocky and more stuff with Jeff Dougherty. We're going to do, in the very, very, very near future, probably start one of the books. Let me know which one. If you'd like me to go into Reptilians, we'll do that. If you'd like to go into the Moses story, which is my favorite book of all the books we've written, we can do that one. I'll have to put on an affectatious British accent to read John's chapters. So there it is. And you know what I want to do with this time? I would like to do a show that has commentary, talks about social issues, talks about, I think it was Suze, you saw that I accidentally put up a premiere today for what was supposed to be a video for new visitors to my site. And I talk about all the things I like to talk about. That's what my YouTube is all about. All the things I like. All the things I want to share with you guys. And from the paranormal to the spiritual, from the historical to the archaeological, from talking about current events, talking about politics, talking about you name it. And so there it is. That's what I want to do. So we're going to do some of that. We're going to see how it goes. And it's not that I haven't done radio before. I have for many years. But we'll see about doing a more or less regular show on here. And we'll get into reading some more books as it comes. So take one more sip of my coffee. Oh, by the way, great garage sale find. I know it's Starbucks, but a massively huge mug. So, there it is. Folks, thanks for being here. I wish I could call you all out. I think I've mentioned almost everybody I've seen here. Thank you for being here. Thanks for listening to the book. You know what you could do that would make my publisher really happy? Go get a copy of this book. You can go, I think the cover price is like $16, but I think you can get them for like $8 or $9 on Amazon. Just go look that up and go pick it up. Put it on your shelf. You've heard it all now. Maybe you'll want to read it someday. Maybe you'll want to just put it on your shelf to have it. And as people have already asked me, I do have some here. You can contact me. It's just more expensive for me because, you got to pay me for what I paid for a box from my publisher and to mail it out to you. But I could sign books for you if you want them. I've got them here. I've got Exodus books here, and I've got about a half a box of Nephilim books, which is roughly 20, 25 books. So, of Nephilim. So if you'd like one, let me know in private, and we'll take it from there. And that's all I got. Go visit my website, scottallenroberts.com. And scottallenroberts.com is spelled like that. A-L-A-N, just my full name, .com. And you can see all I do, all my art that I do, design work. If you have need of any of that stuff, I do that stuff too. I illustrate books. I do design, advertising, marketing work. So you can give me a call for that. And go find me on Facebook if you're not a friend of mine on Facebook. I know a few of you are. So go hit me up on Facebook if you haven't already. And that's all. Thanks for being here. I don't have a catchy closing phrase like Jeff, which is unindoctrinate yourself. Or like Rocky, who has don't take shit from no one. I'll come up with something that works for me. I've got so many things out there. I would quote for you in closing tonight, probably my mantra, what has become my mantra. A Mark Twain quote for years. 20 years from now, you'll regret more the things you didn't do than the things you did do. So cast off from the safe harbor. Set your sails to the trade winds. Explore, dream, discover. There's no better time than now, folks. Thanks for being here. We will talk again soon.